Hello, and thank you so much for joining me for my weekly book chat. This week's book is War of the Windsors. It tells the tale of the rivalry between the two brothers. Now, I really enjoyed this book, and as you can see, I've got lots of bookmarks, lots of little tasters and teasers to share with you. There's no way I can give you a really solid overview of this book in one review, but I can give you a taste of it. And I have to say, it kept me intrigued, it kept me enthralled. If you're interested in this subject, I would recommend this book. The only disappointing thing I will warn you about is the ending. I was really surprised at the ending. It was like all of a sudden Nigel Cawthorne changed personality. It was like someone else wrote the end, because all through the book he was showing sympathy, affection towards the then Prince Charles. He was so understanding of his experience through his childhood. He was so understanding about the fraught relationship between Prince Philip and the then Prince Charles. He was quite damning of Andrew, but at the end of the book he sort of lumped King Charles III in with Andrew in what I thought was quite a dismissive and abrupt way. I was surprised. He didn't give me any real lead up to it. He gave me an indication that he was a little bit critical around the Michael Fawcett era, where the Prince's Trust was getting into all sorts of trouble and Michael Fawcett was sort of doing some quite questionable fundraising, it's been alleged. So there was a little bit of disapproval that crept in there. There was a little bit of disapproval that crept in about the then Prince Charles's extravagance, which I would also put down to being a bit quirky, I think, really, because, you know, he used to send ahead furniture and organic food and that when he used to stay at a friend's place, and so that was quite extravagant. So he was a little bit critical of that. But then right at the end, he just became so critical and lumped him in with Andrew, like I said. So I'll share that bit with you. So if you buy the book, prepare to enjoy and be engrossed and sort of feel like you know how the author feels about everyone in the book until at the end you get a bit of a shock. So I don't know what sort of brought about that. But anyway, I still really enjoyed the book. I still think it's a great book. So, War of the Windsors, let's get on. The inside story of Charles Andrew and the rivalry that has defined the royal family. Now, I'm just going to give you little tasters and my take as we go through with a few little snippets. Now, I'm going to kick off in chapter 2, which actually describes the then Prince Charles's birth. Now, as was usual at the time, Prince Philip wasn't present at the birth of the then Prince Charles. My father wasn't present at my birth either. It just wasn't done sort of at that time. Prince Philip was not present at the birth. He'd been playing squash with his private secretary, Lieutenant Mike Parker. They were taking a swim in the private heated swimming pool in the northwest pavilion of the palace when Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles, the private secretary to George VI, rushed up to tell them of Prince Charles's birth. Hearing that he was a father to a boy, Prince Philip quickly towed himself off, dressed, and made his way to the Belgian suite on the ground floor overlooking the gardens, where Princess Elizabeth was still unconscious from the anaesthetic she'd been given. The King and Queen were already there. They were in evening dress, so they were clearly on their way out somewhere. Queen Elizabeth embraced Philip and King George shook his hand. They went into the nursery to see the child. Then Philip went back out to his wife's bedside and stood there until she awoke. He had with him a huge bouquet of his wife's favourite flowers, thoughtfully supplied by Mike Parker. Asked what his son looked like, Philip said, "A plum pudding." That's not very complimentary, Philip, is it? So then we go on to Andrew's birth. Now, obviously, a lot is, described about the then Prince Charles' childhood. So if you buy the book, you will enjoy that. It's in vivid detail. He really paints a picture. It's almost like you can feel you're in the nursery. You can feel his childhood. You can feel his relationship with his grandmother, the Queen Mother. But we'll skip to Andrew and the take of the staff of Andrew when he was born. According to staff, Andrew was a handful from the beginning. His nanny, Mabel Anderson, called him Baby Grumpling for his temper tantrums. Very telling, isn't it? People don't really change. They don't really change. He called her Mamba and led her a merry dance. She was spared the task of teaching him to bow a curtsy, though, as Charles and Anne had to do, as the Queen had put a stop to that sort of formality. Other time-consuming chores, such as sitting for a royal portrait, were behind the Queen because by this stage, she had been on the throne for 8 years, so she was very confident. She didn't take as many soundings from her late father's, courtiers. She knew what she was about. She ripped through the state papers and the boxes a lot quicker than she originally did when Charles was born, so she had more time on her hands, and she did quite an extraordinary thing after Andrew was born. She took a whole year off from Commonwealth tours and state visits because she wanted to spend a whole year getting to know her newborn second-born. So it was quite lovely, really. Charles used to get half an hour in the morning, and that was pretty much it. And then, his mum would come up after he was bathed and in bed, and she'd give him a kiss goodnight. To be fair to the Queen, like I said, she was the new Queen, and very soon after he was born, she was the new Queen, when he was still a toddler. So, her time was taken up very much so at that time. When he was a baby, in those first few years, she was off in Malta with Prince Philip. That might have been, she enjoyed it. She loved being a young newlywed. I think she loved being away from her parents a bit, having a bit of that freedom. She was confident that Charles was well looked after with his grandparents. And so when she was still a young princess, she had that sort of young newlywed life with Prince Philip. When she got pregnant with Anne, she came back and spent more time with Charles. But Charles just didn't get that early babyhood, toddlerhood attention that Andrew got. So the first half hour after breakfast was devoted to baby Andrew. The boxes could wait. She spent another half hour with him when Mabel Anderson brought him downstairs mid-morning. Well, that never happened with Charles. At lunchtime, the Queen would head up to the nursery. Again, never happened with Charles. She was just too busy. Afternoon engagements were kept to a minimum, so she wheeled him out in the garden in his aging pram to see the flamingos in the lake. The Queen at last embraced the pleasures of motherhood, laughing, smiling and chuckling with the infant. So I think that's where we can get across that the Queen bonded with Andrew. She really bonded with him. And that was why she felt more like a mother, I think, more motherly towards him than she did with Prince Charles. It's not so much a question of love. It's that bonding. It's that time together, isn't it? It's that chance to giggle and laugh and bond. And she never had that with Charles. She was just too busy. Prince Philip called Andrew the boss, as he was willful and self-possessed. Once, after a mock boxing match at bedtime, Andrew whacked him in the eye. That night, Philip was on his way to a film premiere where he was asked how he got the shiner. That was the boss, he said, and everyone thought he meant the Queen. So as you know, Charles was sent off to Gordonstoun first, and Andrew was also sent off to Gordonstoun. Now, their experiences were very different. It's often been implied in other books that it was because Andrew was more easygoing, he was more affable, he was more well-liked. That's why he had an easier time and he wasn't bullied as much. No, that's not true. There was an enormous gap between when Charles went to Gordonstoun and Andrew went to Gordonstoun. And a lot of the sadism and awful practices and bullying and hazing and the encouragement of older boys to pick on younger boys had stopped at that point. Also, a lot of the punishment rituals handed out by staff had stopped at that point. Often punishments weren't followed up and you could just skive off and get away with it. Like you were told to go off on a run when Andrew was there, and often you could just sit behind a bush and hide out until the required amount of time had passed and then make your way back and act puffed. Whereas in Charles's day, it was full on. Everything was strictly supervised. And like I said, the hazing and the bullying was just dreadful, absolutely dreadful. And this chapter, chapter 6, does outline it in detail. I won't ruin it for those who want to purchase a book, but I'll give you a taste. Both Charles and Andrew were sent to Gordonstoun, a tough boarding school on the remote, windswept north coast of Scotland that Philip had been to. For Charles, it was another attempt to toughen him up so that he would be fit to be heir to the throne. Charles hated Gordonstoun even more than Chem, calling it Colditz in kilts, after the notorious German prisoner of war camp in Colditz Castle in Saxony. Now, when you hear this, you really would feel for the boy, you would. When Charles returned home for the holidays, he'd rush to the nursery to spend time with Andrew and Edward and his beloved nanny, Mabel Anderson. Then, when it was time to return to school, he vanished. Footmen were sent to seek him out. He would usually be found crying in his room or reading a bedtime story to Andrew, whom he doted on. It was leaving Mabel that upset him the most. Now, it was said that he had a very difficult relationship with his father. Charles would do anything to please his father. When at the age of 13, Charles proudly announced that he killed his first stag, Philip upbraided him in front of guests at a luncheon for some minor infraction, and one visitor remembered tears welled into his eyes, and a whole table of people were there as he was humiliated by his father. And I thought, how could you do that? So this is first-hand accounts actually given to the author. Now, I want to give you an example of the bullying in Colditz because it was just, unbelievable. Once after taking a shower, the 13-year-old prince was pounced upon, tied up and shoved into a large wicker laundry basket which was hoisted on a hook on the wall and blasted with freezing water. Once his tormentors had had their fun, they left him hanging there naked and shivering for half an hour until a staff member heard his plaintive cries. Now, when you read this book, you realise that probably the staff member was well aware, probably allowed it to happen and probably ignored the plaintive cries. There was a lot of wicked, awful sadism in this school. At night he would be pummeled in the darkness with pillows, shoes and fists until he dreaded going to bed. "The people in my dormitory are foul," he wrote in a letter home to his mother. "Goodness, they are horrid. I don't see how anybody could be so foul." And he would describe the fact that if he would snore, people would throw shoes at him and hit him hard in the head, or actually walk up to his bed and belt him on the head. And so he could never get any sleep because he was always terrified. The headmaster was a sadist who encouraged the older boys to pick on the younger ones, extorting money and food from them. After the housemasters had gone to bed, it was a free-for-all. Again, I'm sure the housemasters knew. The custom was to haze new boys by taking a pair of pliers to the flesh and twist them until the skin tore. I mean, unfathomable, isn't it? The worst of it occurred at Winwood Lodge, and Prince Charles got the worst of the worst. So he used to tell people about this, but, his father would interpret it as weakness, and the Queen believed that, Philip was right, that, well, I think she was reluctant, but, she was willing to bow to Philip on this point. And I think that the show The Crown did sort of point that out, didn't they? And I think that by reading this anyway, by these accounts, and these are accounts, first-hand primary source accounts of what happened to him, actually The Crown was probably pretty spot on with this whole Gordonstoun thing. Now it goes on. We're going to skip on to chapter 7. Andrew's experience of Gordonstoun was very different. Andrew did not shine academically, unlike Charles, but the beds were hard, there were straw mattresses, bread and water, just like a prison. But this is very telling. The regime had loosened up considerably since Charles's time, and it goes on to, describe all the ways it actually had loosened up. So he did get an easier time of it. It wasn't because he was so bloody charming, although he did endear himself to other boys as he regaled them with blue jokes. Plus, Andrew was a sportsman in the conventional sports, hockey, cricket, football, rugby for the school team. And shortly before his brother's 30th birthday, which really does explain the gap, doesn't it? Andrew broke his foot and hobbled into the ballroom with a stick during a Charlie Chaplin walk and waltzed as best he could. So he's very good at doing the hero. His mother had also taught him to be a skilled card player, and he excelled at backgammon. So, yes, he had a bit of a charmed childhood, didn't he? At 16, he went with his parents to the Montreal Olympics, where Canadian girls began to take an interest in him. Most of the family was staying on the Royal Yacht Britannia, though Anne, who was competing in the equestrian events, was staying in the Olympic Village with the rest of the team. Prince Charles got leave from the Navy to join them and brought Prince Edward with him. But it was Andrew who stole the show. He was now as tall as his father, and Charles was forced to concede that Andrew was the one with the Robert Redford looks. Now, I also found it really interesting that after Charles finished at Gordonstoun, he wasn't given any choice what he did next. He went off to Trinity College because it was thought that, yes, as the first royal to sort of go to university and graduate, that would be a good thing. But then straight after that, he was going to go into the Naval College that his father went to. And it says very plainly in this book that he wasn't consulted. He was just told to do what he had to do, and that's what happened to him. Whereas Andrew had more of a choice. Also, when he was at Gordonstoun, he actually entered the RAF flying program. Now, Charles had started flying helicopters off the deck of the ship in the Navy because he had a passion for flying. But you can't help but think, if he was given his choice, he would have actually joined the RAF in the first place. You know, it was a bit of a roundabout way to get to fly. Now, it goes into a lot of detail, obviously, their life in the interim, and I just don't have time to take you all through that. But like I said, well worth getting this book if you're interested in the dynamic between the two brothers. But up to this point, I had a great deal of affection for Charles. I'm not really that huge. I wasn't that huge a fan of the then Prince Charles. I've become more sort of sympathetic towards him, admiring of him, seeing the job he's done as king. But this book actually did give me a lot of genuine affection because you could see that really he just really tried his best. A lot of the time he just really tried his best. Now, I'm going to skip to Andrew and Fergie and them being divorced, but still living at Sunninghill Park. This book gave me a little more detail about that. I didn't really know how Fergie got into Royal Lodge once divorced from Prince Andrew, and this sort of explains it a little bit, so I thought it was very interesting. Although divorced, Andrew and Fergie continued to live in Sunninghill Park. They built, now this is the description of Sunninghill, which I thought was one of the best descriptions I've ever read. They built a 2-storey, 50-room, red brick mock Tudor mansion with a staff of 11. It was mocked as South York after South Fork, the Texan oil tycoon's estate in the 1980s soap opera Dallas. One of the most notable features was a giant marble bathtub that the builders dubbed HMS Fergie. Oh, that was cruel. A spiral staircase from the balcony led to the swimming pool and tennis court. Classy. The couple's initials A and S were embossed on towels and loo rolls, while the musical toilet roll holder played God Save the Queen. It looks like a tart's bedroom, said Prince Philip. So he wasn't really impressed even at that stage. Andrew lived there until 2004 when he moved into the Royal Lodge in Windsor, which had been vacated following the death of the Queen Mother. Fergie moved out in 2006, so she stayed at Sunninghill for that extra 2 years. Now get this, she rented Dolphin House next door to Royal Lodge. The following year, there was a fire at Dolphin House after Fergie left a scented candle alight in the lavatory when she went out for a business meeting. She then had to move into Royal Lodge with her former husband. Okay, I'll leave you to make up your mind about that strategically placed scented candle that caused the fire at Dolphin House. Of course, it wasn't strategically placed. I'm only having a little joke. I'm just having a little bit of fun. Pure accident, pure accident. After 5 years on the market, Sunny Hill Park was sold in 2007 for $15 million, $3 million over the asking price, to an offshore trust. Of course it was. In the British Virgin Islands. And there's all this talk about oligarchs and Kazakhstan and bringing the royal family into disrepute. You'll have to buy the book. But gee, it was juicy, and gee, it was interesting. Now, this is an indication of Andrew's really selfish behaviour. Andrew was overheard in the early morning exchange in his $13 million ski chalet in Verbier, bought with the help of the Bank of Mum. A young guest was making his breakfast tea when Andrew suddenly appeared. "Andrew, would you like a cup?" said the guest. "I'm Prince Andrew to you," Andrew snapped at the host and walked off. And he was no more deferential to the British Rear Admiral. "You can call me Andy," Andrew said. "And you can call me Sir," the Admiral replied. Ooh, ouch, boom. He had his comeuppance then. Now, throughout 2000, there was this continued implication, this continued talk that Andrew Fergie would actually remarry. And in an interview in Tatler magazine in June 2000, he said, "I don't rule remarriage out, and I certainly don't rule it in. If ever the opportunity arose, I do not know what I would do, as it's not in the plan." And Fergie replied, "I simply say, if it should happen, great. If it's not in, it's not ruled out either." So they were spinning the same line. They were spinning the same line to the press. And I think they didn't know. I think they were seeing how this money-earning side of Fergie was actually developing. Because it's quite obvious that after their separation and divorce, that she well and truly went into money-making. Once she got that distance from the crown, she went into money-making. But Andrew was benefiting from that because they were living together at Royal Lodge. So I think, and this is just personal opinion, I did not get this off Andrew Loney. I did not get this off anybody else. It's just my gut instinct that they cooked up the separation, they cooked up the divorce because they wanted Fergie to be free to earn, because they wanted to be richer. By now, of course, Diana and Charles had had William and Harry, so they were very aware that Andrew had slipped well and truly down in the line of succession. Now, of course, it goes into detail about Charles and Diana because I have covered that so extensively in the Housekeeper's Diary, also covered it in last week's weekly book chat. I thought that I would sort of skip over the Charles and Diana aspect of this book a little bit, and I would get into his evaluation of Charles' newly single days. This is prior to Diana actually passing away in that tragic accident. But, you know, Charles was footloose and fancy-free for quite a while, and this is how he spent his time. While Andrew was clocking up the air miles, Charles spent his time shuffling around his 6 homes in the UK, accompanied by a butler, 2 valets, a chef, a private secretary, a typist, royal protection officers, and a truck carrying suitcases and other chattels. In his book, Rebel King, The Making of a Monarch, Tom Bower outlined the complex arrangements that would have to be made before a visit to a friend. Now, I've got that book as well, so that could be one of our weekly book chats. Although, if you really love King Charles III, you're going to be a bit confronted by a lot of the allegations and a lot of the claims made in Tom Bower's book. So you would have to either listen with a pinch of salt or be prepared to be quite hardy. You've got to gird your loins, gird your loins. So, before a visit to a friend, Charles would send his staff ahead a day early with a truck carrying furniture to replace the perfectly adequate contents of their guest rooms. The truck contained Charles and Camilla's complete bedrooms, including the prince's orthopedic bed and his own bed linen. Next came a delivery of organic food. This makes Andrew's oversized dining board and request for room temperature water seem positively modest. So Charles went a little bit wacky-woo, I think, around through this era. He was just totally indulging himself. Now, that could be because after the hard time with his time with Diana, he just felt like the need to indulge himself. He felt like he deserved some sort of reward for enduring that very unhappy marriage. I don't know. Royal biographer Giles Brandreth quotes the Queen saying, "The amount of kit and stuff he takes about, it's obscene." her cousin, Margaret Rhodes, which is a few weekly book chats ago, the Queen finds Charles very difficult. He is extravagant, and she doesn't like that. Now, of course, it does go on and say more detail about that era of Michael Fawcett and the questionable fundraising activities allegedly led by Michael Fawcett. Also, the buying of Dumfries House and how that put them under considerable financial strain. The Prince's Trust under considerable financial strain. So, the Prince had to sort of wade his way out of that. Also, the book goes into stunning detail about the Epstein saga. And I learned things I didn't know. I learned things I didn't know about the Virginia Roberts case. I learned things about how much she really persisted trying to get criminal charges laid way before she actually, started with the civil case. She was constantly at the FBI. The FBI actually proved that photograph was indeed real. They did. And also that was quite pivotal in the Ghislaine Maxwell case. And also it goes into that. It goes into Ghislaine Maxwell. And I can't help thinking that it just seems very sort of unfair. I mean, I'm not suggesting that she didn't deserve her prison sentence. I'm just saying she's the only one that's paying the price for that era at this stage, which just seems extraordinary, doesn't it? Extraordinary that she's paying the price for all these crooks and powerful people that took advantage of young girls and, attended parties on this, obscene island. And yet she's the one in jail. She's the only one in jail. So I don't know if we'll ever see any justice, real justice in that case. So that goes into detail in all that in this book. But I will skip ahead because it's just too much to give you little snippets of. I would do it in injustice. But we'll skip to the fact that the late Queen has died and, of course, Charles is ascended to the throne. And he says a few interesting snippets about that even right back at the beginning after the Queen actually died, the moves were afoot to evict him from the palatial Royal Lodge and downsize him to the 5-bedroom Frogmore cottage. Now, that was just soon after the release of Spare when Harry and Meghan were forcibly vacated. That's how he described it. He didn't say, King Charles chucked them out. He didn't say that. It was also announced he wouldn't be receiving any money from his mother's estate. Now, I speculated that. I didn't realise it was announced. Everything has been left to Charles as assets passed directly from monarch to monarch do not attract inheritance tax. Financially, Andrew is now dependent on handouts from his brother and the generosity of his ex-wife, now a successful children's author with a $3 million Mayfair mansion. But accepting Fergie, he's totally in Charles's hands. And of course, we now know, well, after this book was published, that he has been cut off. He has been well and truly cut off. Now, I'm going to skip to the end of this book. Again, I can't emphasize enough just how much detail this book goes into. If you're interested in the Epstein saga, if you're interested in more about the Michael Fawcett saga, if you're interested in more about the early relationship and Mark Boland and all that era of Charles and Camilla, told from quite a different vantage point from any other book that I've ever read. But this is where it gets weird. Listen to how he sums up this, I think, very good book. The feud between Andrew and Charles, it seems, will never be over, but as this book has tried to demonstrate, the two brothers are more alike than you know. Now, see, that's where it's weird. I feel like someone else has actually written the conclusion because he didn't demonstrate that. He demonstrated how different they were throughout the whole book. And then he's making this switcheroo at the end, which was, I think, rather strange. So they're more alike than you know. And then he describes characteristics: petulant, churlish, self-regarding, self-important, self-serving, self-aggrandizing, grasping, greedy, amoral and corrupt, addicted to pomp and uniforms. They acquire wealth. Now, this is where they were similar. They acquire wealth privately and publicly, and no amount of money is ever enough. Now that I could see through the narration of the book, but the rest I couldn't. I couldn't see that. So anyway, I won't belabor that point, but I just want you to be aware that that was what I picked up. If they weren't living the high life as royals, protected by their royal status, they would surely have suffered much worse fates for their misbehaviour. Possible. There is a great deal of protection that is afforded to you if you are in the royal family. As I also hope this book proves, they are everything their mother was not. Now, this is where the author and I are in agreement, in complete agreement, so it's a good note to finish on. When she commanded respect, they get sycophancy. They can't understand why she was loved and they're not. Well, I think King Charles III is loved now. It's a story of Cain and Abel all over again. Andrew is dead, reputationally at least, while Charles will always carry the mark of Cain. Now, did he put in those last few paragraphs just because he wanted to do the Cain and Abel reference? I hope not. I hope he didn't do that, because that's very opportunistic of an author. But there it is, War of the Windsors, the inside story of Charles Andrew and the rivalry that has defined the royal family. I do recommend this book, so it might be another one to put on your Christmas wish list. I'll see you next Friday night with another surprise weekly book chat. If you enjoyed this, could you share this video with a friend and encourage people to join our weekly book chats? Because I really want to raise these numbers. Also, could you like and subscribe and support me that way? It just helps the algorithm put the weekly book chats out to a bigger audience. And I think I need to expand out to a bigger audience so that I can really get some momentum with these. Thank you so much for your help. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.